This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. This is the second of two special agendas as we look back at the highlights of our shows of 2019. Firstly, one of the most serious crises the world faces is the global opioid epidemic. In the United States alone, more than 350,000 people have died from the misuse of prescription drugs. And to give you some context, that's more than the total number of Americans killed in the Vietnam War. Opioids, in fact, kill 7 people in America every hour, and it's a problem that's now spread to Europe. But what has really caused the epidemic? When you break an arm, neurons send a signal through the spinal cord to the brain. The body will release endorphins, natural painkillers, which act like a key in a lock to activate the brain's opioid receptors, slowing down the body's ability to send pain signals. For some, that's where the story ends. But if the pain continues, many will go back to their doctors to get a prescription for pain medication. And opioids share a chemical similarity to the body's natural endorphins, binding to our opioid pain receptors. The problem is the brain also releases dopamine, the pleasure chemical. When taking opioid painkillers, the receptors in the brain turn off the inhibitory neurons, releasing a euphoric rush of dopamine. But the longer anyone takes the pills, the more the brain will try to regain its balance, forcing the inhibitory neurons to work extra hard and making it harder and harder to release dopamine. And that leads to tolerance, where the patient feels the need to top up their dosage just to feel comfortable. And when the prescription runs out, the inhibitory neurons, which have been working overtime, are let loose, making it almost impossible to release dopamine, meaning more pain, depression, and anxiety. And for some, the only solution is to seek more opioids. Well, here in the United Kingdom, the latest figures show 5 million people are currently prescribed opioids every year, and of those, 500,000 are addicted. The British Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, described the numbers as truly shocking. But how and why do people become addicted? I spoke to Nicki Hari. She's a former prescription opioids addict, but is now admissions coordinator at UK addiction treatment centres. And I asked how she became hooked in the first place.
It started from when I was having problems with my knees, and in the end I had surgery, and from the surgery I was then put on painkillers. So I was put on quite strong opioids, and I never got hooked on them straight away, and I have to say at the time the hospital was quite rigid in what they sent you home with, but it wasn't until sort of early 20s when I was still experiencing knee problems, and I went to the GP with quite acute pain, and I was put on strong painkillers then.
Escalating to what? You still had problems with your knees, but you didn't have pain?
I never actually realised at the time I was becoming reliant on this medication. So I was on...
Even though you didn't have pain?
Well, when I stopped taking them, I did have excruciating pain. What I didn't realise at the time was that was an opioid withdrawal, the same as a heroin withdrawal. Eventually I was manipulating the GPs, and I'd say, I've lost my prescription or I'm going away, I need more to top me up. There was one time when my GP said, you know, that I think this is getting out of hand, we need to look at tapering you off. And I was so scared about that I moved doctors, surgery in the end.
How are you coping? You were married, you had children?
I wasn't coping at all in reality. I thought I was, but my friends and family saw a much bigger picture. I was very depressed, I was isolating, I wasn't doing anything with my children, I was quite inactive. And I think the wake-up call for me was when, at the time, my 8-year-old son returned to school from the summer, and you know they have to write about what they've done. He said Mummy wasn't well all summer, so I stayed at home and played on my Xbox and in the garden. And at that point I thought, what's going on here? And I was trying to analyse it, but I just didn't know what was wrong with me because I didn't see myself as a drug addict. I was taking what the doctors had told me to take. The only pain I had was the pain of withdrawal. So you get flu-like symptoms, you get night sweats, your legs are aching, your bones are aching, you're just shaking, you're sweating, you're depressed, you're crying. It's a whole snowball effect of withdrawals, of not taking what your body actually chemically needs now.
Recovering addict Nicki Hari. Another social epidemic in Europe and the UK is debt. It's an issue facing both the individual and the state. We called it the global debt trap. When we recorded that episode of The Agenda, the US national debt was $22 trillion, but that figure will have risen considerably since then. Some insist the US can afford its debt burden, but what happens to countries that can't? Well, they turn to super global debt advisor Lee Buchheit.
It performs a series of functions. Every year, the IMF conducts what they call surveillance of each member country. They send a team of economists to the country. They assess the country's fiscal and monetary policies, and they offer advice. When a country gets into trouble, their role expands considerably. The IMF will offer financial assistance to the country, but never without strings attached. And those strings take the form of prescriptions for fiscal adjustment, and typically the financial assistance is conditioned upon the country meeting certain prescribed targets. That involvement by the IMF then becomes crucial as the country's other creditors, their government creditors and their commercial creditors, assess whether the country is reforming its economy and stands some chance of repaying the debt on its new terms. And all of that falls on the shoulders of the IMF.
When a country gets into serious trouble, it invariably goes bankrupt. You've represented just about every single country that's gone bankrupt, so that when you land at the airport in that country, is that when they start worrying?
No, they will have started worrying long before that. By the time they get around to calling someone like me, it is clear that they have run out of more palatable options.
Do you have to sometimes return to the country a second time?
Oh,
Do
yeah.
they learn from their mistakes?
You mean, do countries go through debt restructurings multiple times? Yes, I'm afraid they do. Argentina, as you see at the moment, is on the verge of yet another one, having only emerged from the last one 4 years ago.
And the IMF lent them $50 billion.
Well, I think they have now an exposure of $44 billion. Yes, they did. That I think is the largest program the IMF has ever implemented.
Venezuela?
Venezuela is a difficult case, and I'm acting as strategic advisor to the Guaido administration in Venezuela. Venezuela has about 155 billion of external debt. Most of it is in default. But the debt restructuring for that country cannot begin until Nicolas Maduro, the current president, at least as he sees it, leaves. He has proven to be far more adhesive than any of us thought he would be.
Then we turned to individual debt, and we spoke to Johnna Montgomerie, the author of the book, Should We Abolish Household Debts? She told us families shouldn't be blamed for struggling with their finances.
This book is about looking at the bigger picture, the bigger macroeconomic picture that debt is causing. Because if debt is a personal problem, it's one shared by an ever-growing portion of society. And that means that it's not just down to personal choice. There are bigger issues at play. So we hear this example of the #1 reason in the UK that people get into problem debt is because of an unforeseen event. So you are made redundant, your hours are cut, a family member is made ill and are unable to work. These events, we used to have a safety net to allow people to have that cushion until they get back on their feet.
What was that safety net?
So that safety net would have been unemployment benefit for when you're made redundant. You would be allowed to have benefit if you were made ill and unable to work. But now,
and a limited overdraft, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly. And also there would be sort of support for families in terms of, again, when a family member is ill, that it's not just, oh, well, if you can't work today, you won't be paid. So these things have been slowly eroded as the cost of living is going up. And what we find is that more and more people are getting into debt, not only because they've chose to buy things they can't afford, but they've had to go into debt out of necessity. So here we think about young people who took out student loans to get an education, then go into the job market, are precarious laborers, and then are made unemployed. They've built up this debt in good faith to get a start at a future that others were offered and given opportunity without debt. And then we say, well, it's a personal problem. It is slightly a personal problem, but there are also much bigger economic issues at play here. And we need to start thinking in this book about debt abolition as a way of reviving the economy and allowing it to grow in a more sustainable way than this kind of boom-bust bailout cycle that we're currently in and really just on the verge of repeating again.
2019 was a year of elections, both in Europe and in the UK. On the agenda, however, we looked first at the main influences behind the choices the voters faced. And all the pathways we found led to data. We discovered that some of the so-called choices we make as voters appear to be voluntary, but in fact, that's far from the truth. Politicians and businesses are using our data to their advantage. The average person makes around 35,000 decisions a day, ranging from what we want for breakfast, maybe buying a new car, or how we intend to vote in elections. But how do we reach those decisions? What influences us to choose one brand of cereal or one car over another? You may be thinking it's your call, your decision. But what if I told you you aren't thinking straight? In fact, you're thinking under the influence of data. Data has become even more valuable than, say, oil. It's a driving force of power in the Western world. For advertisers, it's a new currency. Transactional data is incredibly important for businesses because it helps them to uncover hidden patterns and correlations so they know where to target their ads for maximum returns. Big data, as it's called, is vital for businesses to identify new business opportunities. That in turn can lead to more business, happier customers, and more importantly for businesses, higher profits. Social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter harvest and sell your personal data to the highest bidder, to advertisers or political parties. Because, of course, a product is only free to use when you are the product. From big data to personal data, you may think your private information is protected, but cybersecurity expert Ken Munro told me a different story. He said it's likely many agencies know everything about you, including your buying habits, your hobbies, and even where you live. First question, I think, is what do you know about me?
Well, you've got a phone in your pocket, haven't you? It's
I have.
An iPhone, isn't it?
It is.
Even without knowing you, meeting you, I know you've got an iPhone in your pocket. I know where you live.
How?
So we do what's called open source intelligence gathering, and that is looking to see what's disclosed about you on the internet, whether that's information you've inadvertently put there or information that's been put there by others.
Sounds a bit sinister, I have to say.
Yeah, unfortunately, if we don't take steps to stop this happening ourselves, that's where the data ends up, and it can be used by nefarious types against us.
You know I had a phone in my pocket, which might be a good guess. I mean, magicians are like that. But you also have some facts about me, I'm told.
I do.
Which I didn't know.
Yeah, so from the same source, we could work out roughly what time you woke up. We know what time you're accurate on social media, and I can get a pretty good stab at what sort of time you go to bed as well.
Strauss, this is secret information.
But it comes from a simple source, Twitter. You use it all the time, and I'm sure as part of your career, it's been really important to you to be attached to the news every morning, so one of the first things you do when you wake up, I know, is the fact you get on Twitter.
That's absolutely right, because without advertising Twitter, I don't want to advertise Twitter, but it's a great research tool for me to find out what is happening around the world overnight. So I like to be connected. Gosh. So let's see what you've got.
Well, one can go a little bit further, and I brought some on. Is that a picture of your house?
It is. That is a picture of my house with my car outside it.
A bit scary, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
But that's actually really easy to do. So through part of your public profile, we could have a good stab at the electoral roll, work out where you lived, and pick up a photograph from Street View.
What else have you got to worry me?
So we've got your date of birth, which will be quite useful. We've got...
29th of March, 74?
No. And sadly, it leads us into other members of your family, which is where things get a little creepy.
Yeah.
Often people don't have a particular concern when they have a public profile, because that's acceptable risk. We understand that.
Yeah.
But it's when other people's in our family start to have their profiles exposed. So, for example, we've got a very similar amount of information about your wife, for example, and also some previous interests. So I'll take a good stab that you've been quite involved in rugby over the years.
I have. That's my big hobby. That's why I love the sport, yeah.
And that's all available online, not even them looking at information you've disclosed, just by joining those breadcrumbs, joining the dots.
So how did you access that information?
Well, so it looks to me like in the past you've been a director of a rugby club.
Yes, that's right.
Pretty rare for someone to have been a director of a sport they didn't enjoy.
True, fair enough.
You can even go a little bit further and start looking at things like from the Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages, things like your parents' histories, your mother's maiden name, which is still a very common security question. What's your mother's maiden name? Yet, for about 50 pence, I can download that information from the online Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages.
So you don't have to hack, because the information is there.
Yep.
Gosh, so that's how private detectives work, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Well, coming up later in this second special look back at 2019, the big story of the year, the UK general election. We asked, is there such a thing as the perfect electoral system?
That's a bit like asking what's the best tool in the toolbox. So a hammer is very good for banging in nails, screwdriver you need for putting in screws, and democracies come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And what you think important in democracy in part informs your view about what the electoral system should be.
CGTN Europe.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
And welcome back to this special edition of The Agenda. When the UK went to the polls, we looked at how and why people turn out to vote, because we wanted to know if there was really such a thing as the perfect democratic election. This is Britain's third general election in 4 years. And here in the House of Commons, it's being called, of course, the Brexit election. But the members of Parliament who sit on these green leather seats know this Christmas election, as it's also being called, is the most important in living memory, and at the same time, with volatile polls and a polarised electorate, one of the least predictable too. And that's because voters face a confusing choice of issues. And how representative will the system be? Well, here in the United Kingdom, the country is divided into 650 constituencies. The voter goes into the booth, has a list of candidates, places one X in the box, and votes. Whoever gets the most votes wins a seat here in the Mother of Parliaments. And that favours the two main parties, rendering millions of votes effectively useless. For example, in 2015, the anti-EU UK Independence Party got 12.6% of the overall vote, but didn't win a single seat in Parliament. So how to change that? Well, some point to party list proportional representation, and that's the most popular electoral system in the world, used in more than 80 countries, including Israel, South Africa, and Brazil. When heading into a polling booth, voters are given a list, which can be just a list of parties known as a closed list, or an open list where there is a list of candidates, and any vote for a candidate counts as a vote for that party. Countries that use this system tend to have lots of parties, and coalition administrations are the norm. But it can also allow for the rise of extremist parties, weak coalitions, and especially in a closed list system, a real disconnect between the voters and the personalities they elect, as that's up to the party itself to decide. Best of all, many experts argue, would be the single transferable vote system, a form of proportional representation they use in Ireland, Malta, and Australia. Now, when a voter enters the polling booth, they vote for candidates in their order of preference. To get elected, a candidate needs a certain amount of votes, called the quota. If anyone gets more number ones than the quota, they're immediately elected. But instead of ignoring any extra votes a candidate receives after winning, these votes then transfer to each voter's second favourite candidate, and so on. It's a great way to make sure literally everyone's vote counts, but it can be unwieldy, and the process of counting takes several days. So which is really best for Britain in one of the most difficult to predict elections in decades? And is there really any such thing as the perfect electoral system? Well, to try to answer that question, I spoke to the Emeritus Professor of Political Theory and Public Policy at University College London, Professor Albert Wheel.
That's a bit like asking what's the best tool in the toolbox. So a hammer is very good for banging in nails, screwdriver you need for putting in screws, and democracies come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And what you think important in a democracy in part informs your view about what the electoral system should be. So, for example, if you think that having single-party accountable government is a central part of democracy, then you're inclined towards our present system that we use in the UK of first past the post. If you think a broad representation of public opinion in Parliament is very important, then you're more inclined towards proportional representation systems. That's just one aspect of a complex problem.
First past the post, though, will inevitably mean millions of votes are ignored. Does that mean it can ever truly work democratically?
Well, it can work under certain circumstances. So in a situation, for example, that characterised the UK in the 1950s, when over 95% of voters voted either Labour or Conservative, then you can say that the sort of two-party competition with the marginal voters determining whether we had a Labour government or a Conservative government could work pretty well. Life becomes much more difficult when you've got a situation of 3, maybe 4 parties, and then I think you really do have some difficulties with first past the post.
But proportional representation, that can have its drawbacks too, can't it?
It can indeed. I think it's important to remember that proportional representation comes in all sorts and shapes and sizes.
Which is one of its criticisms.
Which is one of its criticisms. But then this is a case that, I mean, anybody who studied voting systems will tell you, this is a case where details matter. So, for example, it depends upon whether you have a threshold or not. So some systems like Germany have a 5% threshold. They have proportional representation, but your party cannot be represented in the parliament unless it gets 5% of the votes. Other systems like the Netherlands don't have such a threshold, and therefore you typically get many more parties represented in the parliament. So these details matter enormously.
And extremist parties, they tend to do rather well under PR, don't they?
Well, that's one of the reasons for having a threshold. One of the reasons for having a threshold is it puts a hurdle up against potentially extremist parties. It's also worth bearing in mind that under first past the post, if a party cannot get an overall majority in the House of Commons, say, then it may well find itself dependent upon a particular party to give it confidence and supply, which some people might regard as being extremist. So you can't entirely eliminate the possibility of extremist parties having influence within a democratic system.
In the 2019 election, an increasing number of people used vote-swapping websites to make sure their vote did count. A vote swap is when a voter in one constituency agrees to vote tactically for a candidate or party who wouldn't have been their first choice, but does have a greater chance of winning in that area. In exchange, a voter in another constituency will vote for the candidate or party the first voter supports, where they actually have a real chance of getting elected. To explain exactly in detail how that works and why people do it, I invited the co-founder of a group called Swap My Vote, Tom de Grundwald, onto the show.
A voter will go to our website, swapmyvote.uk, and put in the party that they'd really like to vote for. Then they will also say which party they're willing to vote for. And for most people, this will be the tactical recommendation in their constituency. This will be the party that has a chance, as you say, of winning the seat. Once they do that, they click Swap My Vote, and then they log in with Facebook or Twitter. And that means that there's an identity that can be browsed by prospective swapping partners. After that, they're presented with a number of, with 5 actually, possible partners who have the complementary voting preferences in another constituency. And they can, if one of them seems like a good place for their vote to be cast, then they can offer a swap. The other person will then see an email saying, Stephen would like to swap votes with you, and can either confirm or look for another swap. Once they've both confirmed, they are introduced to each other on social media so that they can maybe have a little chat, check that each other actually care about the sorts of things that each other care about and that they want to work for the same kind of greater good.
And finally, 2019 was a year dominated by elections in Europe and by an end-of-the-year Brexit election in the United Kingdom. New brooms were appointed in Brussels, and Europe's new Compromise Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, announced she wanted Europe to be the world's first climate-neutral continent. In Britain, a stonking Conservative election win put the Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the driving seat as far as Brexit negotiations with the EU are concerned. It wasn't a coincidence that a far warmer tone started almost immediately to come across the channel from Brussels. In Britain, the election result put an end to the months of speculation and doubt, and voters across the political spectrum will be glad that 2020 begins after 3 elections in 4 years with that degree of political certainty. The main opposition, Labour Party, however, ended the year with its leadership in tatters. In France, President Macron's proposed pension reforms were equally unpopular and led to rioting on the streets. In Germany, the still popular Angela Merkel announced she wouldn't be seeking re-election at the next federal election. So big changes to come across Europe, while the UK waits to hear if the years of economic austerity are finally over. If that announcement is made, then this year's New Year's celebrations will be louder than many people can remember. And that's all from this week's agenda. Next time, and indeed next year on the agenda, we'll be looking at the one thing everybody seems to be looking for in 2020, and that's happiness. We'll be questioning the happiness agenda. Is trying too hard to be happy in fact making us miserable? Plus, are we born happy or unhappy? We look at whether it's possible to learn to be more cheerful. Don't forget, for more of the Agenda's content, you can visit us on Facebook and YouTube or follow us on Twitter. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team in London, it's goodbye and Happy New Year.